I don't even know where to begin, but I need to get this off my chest. My name's Mark, and I've been married to Lydia for 6 years. We don't have kids, not for lack of trying, but sometimes life has its own cruel plans. Lydia is everything you'd want in a partner. She's smart, beautiful, ambitious, and damn good at her job as an interior designer. She's always had this magnetic energy about her that drew people in, me included. I run a small car dealership, and while my work keeps me busy, I've always made time for Lydia. Or at least, I thought I did. We've had our ups and downs like any couple, but I never thought I'd be sitting here writing about this. The first signs were subtle, so subtle I brushed them off as nothing. Lydia started working late more often, but she always had a reasonable explanation: meetings, deadlines, demanding clients. Her phone, which used to buzz non-stop, suddenly became eerily silent when we were together. She said she'd been keeping it on, do not disturb, so she could focus on work. I didn't think much of it at first. She's always been dedicated to her career. Then, about a month ago, she took on a new project designing the interior of a house for a man named David. She mentioned him in passing, an old friend from her college days who had come back into her life. It's funny, she said, smiling, how life brings people back around when you least expect it. I didn't think anything of it. Why would I? She seemed genuinely excited about the project, and I wanted to support her. Looking back, I feel like an idiot for not seeing the signs sooner. But hindsight's 20/20, right? At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Lydia was always passionate about her projects, and this one was no different. She spent hours at her desk, sketching layouts and picking out swatches. She talked about David's house like it was her magnum opus. "He's giving me so much creative freedom," she told me one evening. "I can't wait for you to see it when it's done." I remember smiling at her, feeling proud. I thought her excitement was just about the work. But then, small things started to shift. She began dressing differently when she went out for meetings, not just stylish but more alluring. Lydia's always been stunning, but now she seemed to be putting in extra effort. When I teased her about trying to impress her clients, she laughed it off, saying, "It's just professional, Mark. You know how competitive my field is." Her late nights became more frequent. At first, it was just an extra hour here or there. Then it was dinners she had to attend with clients or vendors. She started coming home smelling like expensive wine and perfume, looking flushed and happy. I convinced myself that it was the thrill of her career taking off. But the distance between us grew. Conversations that used to flow easily became stilted. She was always distracted, her phone glued to her hand when she thought I wasn't looking. When I tried to initiate intimacy, she often turned me down, claiming she was too tired or stressed. That hurt, but I told myself it was just a rough patch. The first real red flag came one evening when I walked into her office while she was on her laptop. She quickly minimized whatever she was working on and flashed me a nervous smile. "Just boring work stuff," she said, her tone light but her body language tense. It wasn't like her to be secretive. I felt a pang of unease but didn't press her. I trusted her. Or at least, I wanted to. Then, about 2 weeks ago, she told me she had a late meeting at the project site. She promised she wouldn't be long, but hours passed, and she didn't come home. I texted her, no response. I called, straight to voicemail. My gut was telling me something wasn't right, but I ignored it, convincing myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. I didn't realize it then, but that night was the beginning of the end. The night Lydia didn't come home on time left me restless. I sat in the living room, alternating between staring at the clock and my phone. Midnight turned into 1 a.m., then 2 a.m., and I couldn't shake the knot in my stomach. When she finally walked through the door around 2:30 a.m., I didn't know whether to be relieved or angry. "Sorry, Mark," she said, her voice calm but rushed. "The meeting ran longer than I expected, and my phone died." I didn't want to call from the client's phone, it felt unprofessional. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But something about the way she avoided my eyes, the faint hint of cologne on her jacket that definitely wasn't mine, it all felt off. Still, I swallowed my suspicions and let it go. She'd never given me a reason not to trust her before, and I didn't want to be the paranoid husband. But the doubts lingered. A couple of days later, I noticed something strange when I picked up her phone to move it off the kitchen counter. It was locked, as usual, but the screen lit up with a notification, a message from someone named D. It wasn't a full text, just the preview, "Can't wait to see yo," before it cut off. I froze, staring at the screen. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe it was a colleague, a vendor, anyone but. "Mark, what are you doing with my phone?" Lydia's voice startled me. She stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. I quickly set the phone down. "Just moving it," I said, trying to sound casual. But the way she grabbed it and clutched it to her chest like it was a lifeline didn't go unnoticed. She didn't say anything, just walked out of the room. That was the moment I realized I couldn't keep ignoring the signs. Something was going on, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. After the incident with her phone, my mind was in overdrive. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but I didn't have solid proof. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that the message from D could have been a coworker, a vendor, anyone. But the gnawing suspicion kept me up at night. The thing about suspicion is that it doesn't fade, it festers. Every little thing she did started to feel like a clue in some unsolvable puzzle. Her laughter when she texted late at night. The way she seemed to disappear into her work, more focused than I'd ever seen her. Even the fact that she kept her phone on silent around me suddenly felt calculated. It was like there was a wall between us, one I couldn't see but could definitely feel. One Friday afternoon, I decided to push my doubts aside and surprise her. She had told me she'd be working from home on designs for David's house, so I thought I'd bring her lunch, a gesture to remind her that I cared, that I noticed how hard she was working. I picked up her favorite salad and some pastries from the cafe she loved. It felt like the right thing to do. When I walked in, I found her at her desk, but she wasn't sketching or looking at design software. She was on a video call, her face lit up in a way that didn't feel like work. I couldn't see who she was talking to, but I caught a glimpse of her smile, wide, warm, and too familiar. The kind of smile she used to save for me. She ended the call abruptly when she saw me, her expression shifting to something guarded. "Mark. I didn't hear you come in," she said, her voice light but strained. "Thought I'd surprise you," I replied, setting the food on the table. "You looked busy." She glanced at her laptop, then back at me. "Just finalizing some details with David. His house is really coming together." There it was again, his name. David. I hadn't thought much about him before, but now it felt like his name was a thread unraveling everything. I wanted to ask her about the call, about why she'd shut her laptop so quickly, but the words wouldn't come. I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. That night, while she slept, I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene in my head. Her smile. The way she ended the call so quickly. The name, David, hanging in the air like a storm cloud. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next morning, I made up an excuse to leave the house early, telling her I had some paperwork to catch up on at the dealership. In truth, I wasn't going to work, I was going to find out more about this David guy. She'd mentioned his house was nearby, and I remembered the address from when she first took on the project. It wasn't hard to find online. When I arrived, the house was stunning, a modern design with large windows that gave a perfect view of the sleek furniture and half-finished interiors Lydia had been working on. There were no cars in the driveway, but that didn't mean much. I didn't go inside. I didn't have a plan. I just sat there, staring at the house, wondering what role it played in this growing distance between Lydia and me. I felt pathetic, stalking my own wife's project like some paranoid fool. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just insecurity. Something was happening, and it involved this house. When I got home, Lydia was in the shower. Her phone was on the counter, and for the first time, I let my suspicion get the better of me. I picked it up. Her password hadn't changed. My hands trembled as I opened her messages. There he was. David. The texts were friendly at first, updates about the project, decisions on color schemes, jokes about his bad taste in furniture. But then they shifted. There was one from a week ago, dinner was amazing. I haven't laughed like that in years. And another, I can't stop thinking about last night. My stomach dropped. It didn't take long to find out what last night meant. A series of messages, each more damning than the last, painted a picture I didn't want to see. I scrolled, unable to stop myself, until I found one from just 2 days ago. Let's meet at the house tonight. I'll set the mood. My blood ran cold. I didn't confront her right then. I couldn't. My heart was pounding, my mind racing with anger, hurt, confusion. Instead, I put her phone back exactly where I found it and left the house to clear my head. I needed time to think, to figure out what I'd do next. When I left the house that morning, I didn't have a destination in mind. I drove aimlessly through town, my thoughts looping in an endless cycle of anger and disbelief. Every detail of our life together seemed to play on a mental slideshow: our wedding day, the nights we stayed up talking about having kids, the laughter we shared over mundane, everyday things. It all felt like a cruel joke now, a facade that was crumbling before my eyes. The texts from David haunted me. I can't stop thinking about last night. What the hell had happened last night? My imagination ran wild, filling in gaps with the worst possible scenarios. Was she with him while I sat at home, waiting for her to come back from a supposed late meeting? Had they laughed at my ignorance? The betrayal felt unbearable, and yet, I still wasn't ready to confront her. I needed more than texts. I needed the full truth. I drove past the dealership without stopping, knowing I wouldn't be able to focus on work. Instead, I ended up at a coffee shop on the outskirts of town, a place where no one would recognize me. I ordered a black coffee I didn't plan to drink and sat in the corner, staring out the window. The truth of what I'd found was too heavy to process all at once. A part of me wanted to storm back home, shove her phone in her face, and demand answers. But another part, one I hated to admit existed, was terrified of hearing her confirm my worst fears. Instead, I pulled out my own phone and started digging. If David was the man my wife was betraying me with, I needed to know who he was. Lydia had mentioned he was an old college friend, but she hadn't gone into much detail. A quick search of his name and the city pulled up his LinkedIn profile. David Prescott. CEO of a successful tech startup. Mid-30s, tall, well-dressed, and charismatic, the kind of guy who could charm anyone in the room. The photos showed him at networking events, posing with his team, and occasionally in more casual settings, looking effortlessly handsome. My chest tightened as I scrolled through his public posts. There were no mentions of a wife or girlfriend, no family photos. He seemed to live a bachelor's life in his modern, pristine house, the same house Lydia had been designing. A thought struck me then, cold and unrelenting: was the house just an excuse for them to see each other? It would explain her late nights, the long hours, the sudden enthusiasm for this particular project. I closed my phone and leaned back in my chair, the weight of it all settling on my shoulders. The man was successful, attractive, and clearly had a history with my wife. I couldn't compete with that, not now, not after years of trying and failing to build the family we'd both dreamed of. Was that why she turned to him? Had she grown tired of me and the life we shared? By the time I left the coffee shop, the day had slipped into the late afternoon, but my mind was no clearer than it had been that morning. I drove back home slowly, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I walked through the door, Lydia was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she chopped vegetables for dinner. She looked so serene, so ordinary, that for a moment I wondered if I'd imagined everything. But then I remembered the texts, her smiles during the video call, the name, David, hanging over us like a dark cloud. I couldn't bring myself to talk to her about it. Not yet. Instead, I played along, sitting at the table and making small talk while she cooked. She told me about her day in vague terms, avoiding specifics about where she'd been or who she'd seen. I nodded, smiled, pretended everything was fine, all while my stomach churned with unease. Later that night, after she'd gone to bed, I found myself pacing the living room. The texts, the late nights, the cologne on her jacket, it all pointed to one thing, but I still wanted to believe there was some other explanation. That maybe I was wrong. That I could wake up tomorrow and find this had all been a bad dream. But deep down, I knew. And I also knew that I couldn't keep pretending much longer. The truth was unraveling, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. A few days passed, but the weight of suspicion hadn't eased. If anything, it had grown heavier, more suffocating. Lydia was as distant as ever, spending more time than usual on her laptop and frequently stepping out to take calls. Every time she said she had a client dinner, or a late meeting, my mind went back to those texts from David. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was mounting. Then came the night that broke everything. It was a Wednesday, and Lydia told me over breakfast that she'd be working late. David wants to finalize some details on the house, she said casually, sipping her coffee. He's a bit of a perfectionist, so it might take a while. I nodded, keeping my face neutral. Do you want me to save dinner for you? She smiled, the same warm, effortless smile that had first drawn me to her years ago. No need. I'll probably grab something quick on the way home. Her words felt rehearsed, like a line she'd said too many times before. That evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just working late. Something about her demeanor that morning had been different, too calm, too collected. It was like she was trying to sell me a story she knew I wouldn't question. But I wasn't the same trusting husband I'd been a week ago. Around 8 p.m., I decided I couldn't sit and wait any longer. If she was with David, I needed to know. My heart pounded as I grabbed my car keys and headed out. The drive to David's house felt like an eternity, even though it was only about 20 minutes away. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that they ached, and my thoughts raced with every possible scenario. When I pulled up to the house, the driveway was empty, but the lights were on inside. Through the large front windows, I could see the faint glow of candles flickering. My stomach twisted at the sight. Candles? This wasn't a business meeting. I parked a little down the street, far enough not to be noticed, and sat in the car for a moment, trying to calm the storm raging inside me. A part of me wanted to turn around, to go home and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I couldn't. I had to know. I approached the house quietly, sticking to the shadows. As I got closer, the faint hum of music reached my ears, a soft, romantic melody that made my chest tighten. My hands shook as I peered through one of the windows, my breath catching in my throat at what I saw. Lydia was sitting at the dining table with David. The table was set for two, complete with a bottle of wine and the flicker of candlelight. She was laughing at something he'd said, her head tilted back in that carefree way I hadn't seen in years. David leaned closer, his hand brushing hers. She didn't pull away. The scene felt like a punch to the gut, but I couldn't look away. I watched as they finished their wine and stood, their movements fluid and intimate. David placed a hand on her lower back, guiding her toward the living room. She didn't resist. My pulse thundered in my ears as I moved around the house, trying to stay out of sight. I found another window that gave me a clear view of the living room. They were on the couch now, sitting closer than they should have been. David said something, and Lydia laughed softly, her hand resting on his arm. Then, as if in slow motion, he leaned in and kissed her. And she kissed him back. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My wife, the woman I'd built my life with, was here with another man, kissing him like she'd never kissed me. It wasn't just the kiss, though, it was the way she looked at him, the way her body leaned into his as if he were the only person in the world. I wanted to burst in, to shout, to demand an explanation. But my feet were rooted to the ground. I stood there, frozen, as they deepened the kiss. Her hands moved to his chest, his to her waist, and before I knew it, their clothes were starting to come off. The intimacy of the moment was unbearable. This wasn't just a fling, it was something deeper, something that had been building for weeks, maybe months. I stumbled back from the window, my chest heaving. My world was shattering, and I didn't know how to stop it. Standing there, hidden in the shadows outside David's house, I felt like an intruder in my own life. Watching Lydia kiss him, touch him, was unbearable. It wasn't just the act itself but the intimacy of it. The way her body language screamed comfort, connection. It wasn't something casual or fleeting, this was deliberate. Intentional. It wasn't just sex, it was something more. I don't remember how long I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching the scene unfold like a bad dream. My thoughts raced, each one hitting me like a hammer. How could she do this? How long has this been going on? Does she even love me anymore? I should have walked away then. But I didn't. Instead, I did something I never thought I'd do. I went back to my car, grabbed my phone, and started recording. I don't know what possessed me. Maybe it was the need for proof, for something tangible to show her when she inevitably tried to deny it. Or maybe it was a twisted sense of justice. Either way, I held the phone steady as I captured the moment my marriage truly ended. The recording only lasted a minute or two, but it felt like hours. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the phone when I shoved it back into my pocket. I didn't stay to see what happened next. I couldn't. I turned and walked back to my car, each step heavier than the last. By the time I got inside, my chest felt like it was going to cave in. My breaths came out shallow and ragged, my vision blurred with tears I hadn't realized were falling. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel and staring at nothing. The pain was overwhelming, a suffocating wave that made it hard to think, hard to breathe. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to do anything to release the anger and betrayal coursing through me. But all I could do was sit there in silence, the image of Lydia and David burned into my mind. When I finally started the car, I didn't know where I was going. Home didn't feel like an option. The idea of walking into the house we'd built together, the house where she'd kissed me and told me she loved me, felt unbearable. Instead, I drove aimlessly, the streets blurring past as my thoughts spiraled. At some point, I ended up at a park we used to visit when we were first dating. It was quiet now, the kind of quiet that comes with the late hours of the night. I parked the car and got out, walking to one of the benches by the lake. The air was cold, but I didn't feel it. My mind was too numb to process anything beyond the raw ache in my chest. Sitting there, staring at the still water, I let the tears come. I wasn't the type to cry, not really. But this broke me. The life I thought I had was gone. The woman I thought I knew was a stranger. And the worst part? I had no idea what to do next. By the time I returned home, it was nearly 2 a.m. Lydia's car was in the driveway, meaning she'd come back while I was gone. I sat in my car for a moment, debating whether to go inside or sleep in the dealership office. But I couldn't avoid her forever. I had to face her. Eventually. When I walked in, the house was dark except for the soft glow of the kitchen light. She was sitting at the dining table, her laptop open in front of her. She looked up when she heard me, her expression unreadable. "Hey," she said softly. "You're home late. Everything okay?" Her voice was calm, casual, like she hadn't spent the evening in another man's arms. It took everything in me not to snap right then and there. Instead, I nodded, muttering something about a late-night work emergency before heading straight to the bedroom. I couldn't look at her. Not yet. As I closed the door behind me, the weight of the night settled in. My marriage was falling apart, and the woman I loved was the one tearing it down. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I wanted to save it anymore. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. My body ached from the tension of the night before, and my mind was already racing before I even opened my eyes. Lydia's side of the bed was empty, and I could hear the faint clinking of dishes in the kitchen. She was up, going about her morning as if everything was fine. But it wasn't. Not even close. I lay there for a while, trying to gather my thoughts, to figure out what I was going to say. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to show her the recording and demand answers. But another part, the part that still loved her, no matter how much it hurt, hesitated. Once I brought it up, there was no going back. When I finally walked into the kitchen, she greeted me with a smile. "Morning," she said, her tone cheerful. "I made coffee. Do you want some?" Her casual demeanor felt like a slap in the face. How could she act like nothing was wrong? Like she hadn't just spent the night betraying me? My jaw tightened as I shook my head. "No, I'm good." She glanced at me, her smile fading slightly. "Are you okay? You seem off." The question was almost laughable. "I'm fine," I said, my voice colder than I intended. I sat down at the table, staring at her as she moved around the kitchen. Every little thing she did, pouring her coffee, tying her hair back into a loose ponytail, felt like a reminder of the woman I thought she was. The woman who no longer existed. "Lydia," I finally said, my voice steady but firm. She turned to look at me, her expression curious. "What's up?" I took a deep breath, the words heavy on my tongue. "Where were you last night?" Her eyes flickered, just for a moment, but it was enough. "I told you, I was working late at David's house. We were finalizing some things for the project." I nodded slowly, my heart pounding. "And that's all it was? Work?" Her smile faltered. "Of course. Why do you ask?" I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "Because I drove by the house last night." The color drained from her face. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us deafening. "I saw you, Lydia," I said, my voice shaking with barely contained anger. "I saw you with him." Her hands trembled as she set her coffee mug on the counter. "Mark, I can explain." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice rising. "Don't insult me by trying to explain it away. I stood there and watched you, Lydia. I saw everything." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not what I think." I snapped, standing up so quickly that my chair scraped against the floor. "I think you've been cheating on me with David. I think you've been lying to me for weeks, maybe months. So tell me, Lydia, what am I missing?" She flinched at the venom in my voice, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice breaking. It just happened. It just happened." "That's your excuse." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Do you have any idea what you've done? What you've destroyed?" Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't care. The image of her with David was burned into my mind, and no amount of tears could erase it. "I loved you, Lydia. I trusted you. And this is how you repay me." "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to hurt you. I don't know what I was thinking." I stared at her, my chest heaving with anger and pain. Why, Lydia? Why him? She hesitated, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. David was my first love, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Seeing him again brought back so many feelings, so many memories. I didn't plan for this to happen, Mark. I swear. But, it just did. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Her first love. That explains so much, but it didn't make it any easier to stomach. And what about us? I asked, my voice raw. What about everything we've been through together? Did that mean nothing to you? It meant everything, she said, her voice cracking. You mean everything to me. But I've been so unhappy, Mark. I didn't know how to tell you. Her confession felt like another betrayal. So instead of talking to me, you ran to him. You threw away our marriage for some fleeting fantasy. I didn't mean to throw it away, she said, her voice desperate. I don't want to lose you, Mark. Please, we can fix this. I shook my head, my heart breaking all over again. I don't know if we can, Lydia. I don't know if I can ever forgive you. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of everything we'd lost. For the first time in my life, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if there was anything left to save. After Lydia's tearful confession, I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The walls seemed to close in on me, the memories of our life together twisting into something bitter and painful. I grabbed my jacket and walked out, ignoring her desperate pleas for me to stay and talk. Mark, please, she called after me, her voice cracking. Don't just leave like this. We need to figure this out. But I couldn't. Not then. The air inside felt toxic, suffocating. I needed space, distance, anything to think clearly without her presence clouding my emotions. I ended up at the dealership, sitting in the dimly lit office with nothing but the hum of the vending machine to keep me company. My head was spinning, replaying every word she'd said, every excuse she'd given. David was my first love. That line haunted me. How long had she been carrying those feelings? Had she ever truly let them go, or had I just been a placeholder all these years? I tried to distract myself by going through the stack of invoices on my desk, but it was pointless. My hands shook too much to hold a pen, and the words on the papers blurred as my eyes welled up. I felt pathetic, weak. This wasn't supposed to be my life. I'd done everything right, hadn't I? I'd been a good husband, supportive, loyal. And yet, it hadn't been enough. By the time dawn rolled around, I hadn't slept a wink. My body ached from the tension, my mind exhausted but unwilling to shut down. I couldn't avoid Lydia forever, though. I knew I had to go back and face her, to decide what came next. When I walked through the door that morning, the house was eerily quiet. Lydia was sitting on the couch, her face pale and blotchy from crying. She looked up when I entered, her eyes searching mine for something, hope, forgiveness, anything. Mark, she said softly, standing as if to approach me, but I held up a hand to stop her. Don't, I said, my voice hoarse. I can't do this right now. She froze, her face crumpling with fresh tears. Please, we need to talk. I need you to understand. Understand what? I snapped, my anger bubbling to the surface. That you've been lying to me. That you've been sneaking around with another man while I've been sitting here, clueless. She flinched, but I didn't care. I was too far gone, too consumed by the betrayal. I gave you everything, Lydia. Everything. And you threw it away for what? Some old flame who waltzed back into your life and made you feel nostalgic. It's not like that, she said, her voice desperate. It wasn't about choosing him over you. It was. I don't know. It was a mistake, Mark. A terrible, stupid mistake. A mistake. I laughed bitterly. Mistakes happen once, Lydia. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. Repeated choices. Every text, every meeting, every kiss, you chose this. You chose him. Her tears fell harder, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy. Not now. Not after everything I'd seen and heard. I want to fix this, she said, her voice breaking. I love you, Mark. I love us. Please, don't throw it all away. Her words cut deep, but they felt hollow. How could she say she loved me while carrying on with David? How could she expect me to believe her now? I need time, I finally said, my voice cold. I don't even know what to think right now. Or how to feel. But I can't be around you, not like this. Her sobs filled the silence as I turned and headed for the bedroom. I grabbed a duffel bag and began throwing clothes into it, my movements mechanical. She stood in the doorway, watching me, her face streaked with tears. Where are you going? She asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, I said honestly. But I can't stay here. She didn't try to stop me as I walked out the door. For the second time in less than 24 hours, I found myself driving aimlessly, my thoughts a chaotic mess. This time, though, I wasn't just running from her. I was running from the life we'd built, the life that now felt like a lie. After I left the house, I drove without a destination, letting the road carry me wherever it wanted. The car became my sanctuary, the hum of the engine a steady backdrop to the chaos in my mind. I ended up miles outside of town, on a quiet, winding road that led to a lake we used to visit years ago. It had been one of Lydia's favorite spots, a place where we'd go to escape the pressures of work and the world. The irony wasn't lost on me as I parked and got out, the crisp morning air stinging my face. The lake was as still as I remembered, its surface a mirror reflecting the gray sky above. I sat on a bench by the water, my head in my hands, trying to make sense of everything. The betrayal felt like a physical wound, a sharp, gnawing pain in my chest that wouldn't go away. I thought about the life we'd built together, the dreams we'd shared, and how easily she'd thrown it all away. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. I hesitated before looking at the screen, half expecting it to be Lydia. But it wasn't. It was a text from my best friend, Jake. Hey, man. Haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay? I stared at the message, debating whether to respond. Jake and I had been close since college, and he was one of the few people I trusted implicitly. But telling him about Lydia and David felt like admitting it was real, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Instead, I put the phone back in my pocket and focused on the water. The stillness was soothing, but it didn't quiet the storm inside me. My thoughts kept circling back to her words, I didn't mean for this to happen. How many times had she said that? As if her betrayal had been some cosmic accident, instead of a series of deliberate choices. The sound of footsteps behind me broke the silence. I turned to see an older man walking his dog, his face weathered but kind. He nodded at me as he passed, and I managed a weak smile in return. For a moment, I envied him, his simple, peaceful life. He didn't seem like a man who'd had his world turned upside down by someone he trusted. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. I stayed there, watching the lake, letting the weight of everything settle in. At some point, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Lydia. I stared at the screen, her name glaring back at me. Part of me wanted to answer, to yell at her, to demand more answers. But another part of me, the part that was tired and broken, couldn't bear to hear her voice. I let it go to voicemail. When the sun began to set, I knew I couldn't stay at the lake forever. I needed to figure out my next move, whether it was staying in a motel for a few days or crashing at a friend's place. Going home wasn't an option, not yet. The thought of seeing her, of being in the same space where her betrayal had taken root, was unbearable. As I got back in the car, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Jake, seriously, man, let me know you're okay. I'm here if you need anything. This time, I responded, I'll explain later. Just, going through some stuff. His reply came almost instantly, whatever it is, you don't have to go through it alone. Let me know when you're ready to talk. I sighed, grateful for his concern but not ready to unpack everything yet. As I drove away from the lake, the darkening sky seemed to mirror the uncertainty I felt about my future. For the first time in years, I had no idea where my life was headed. All I knew was that the life I thought I had was gone, and I wasn't sure if I wanted it back. I spent the night in a motel on the outskirts of town. The room was small and unremarkable, but it felt like a refuge from the chaos of my life. I lay on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling as the hours dragged on. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was restless, filled with fragmented dreams of Lydia and David. By the time the sun rose, I was more exhausted than I'd been the night before. Jake's messages had stayed on my mind, though. As much as I wanted to handle this on my own, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to talk to someone who knew me, who could offer perspective. After hours of debating with myself, I finally picked up my phone and called him. Mark. Jake's voice was groggy but immediately concerned. Hey, man. You okay? It's early. Sorry to wake you, I said, my voice hoarse. I needed to talk. No worries, he said quickly. What's going on? You sound like hell. I hesitated, the words sticking in my throat. How do you tell someone that your entire world has imploded? It's Lydia, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She's been seeing someone else. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Jake wasn't the type to mince words, but this news seemed to leave even him speechless. Shit, he said finally. Mark, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? Wait, no, that's a stupid question. Of course you're not. I let out a humorless laugh. Yeah, no. I'm not okay. I don't even know where to start. I caught her, saw it with my own eyes. She was with some guy named David. Apparently, he's her first love or something. Her first love. Jake's voice was sharp. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Is she trying to justify it? Pretty much, I said bitterly. She says it just happened. That she didn't mean for it to go this far. But Jake, this wasn't a one-time thing. It's been going on for weeks, maybe longer. Damn, he said, his tone heavy with anger on my behalf. That's low. You don't deserve that, man. You've always been good to her. Hearing his validation felt like a small lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't crazy for feeling betrayed. I don't know what to do, I admitted. She says she wants to fix it, that she doesn't want to lose me. But how do I even begin to trust her again? Is that even possible? Jake sighed, and I could picture him running a hand through his hair. Look, I'm not going to tell you what to do. That's a decision only you can make. But I will say this, you deserve someone who's all in, Mark. Someone who values you and the life you've built together. If she's not that person, maybe it's time to walk away. His words hit me hard. Walking away felt impossible, like cutting off a limb. But staying felt equally unbearable. I don't know if I can make that decision right now, I said. Everything's still so raw. And that's okay, Jake said gently. Take your time. But don't let her guilt trip you into rushing it. This is about you now, what you need, what you deserve. Not her. We talked for a while longer, his calm, steady presence a balm to my frayed nerves. By the time we hung up, I felt a little less alone, though no closer to figuring out what to do. Jake had offered to let me stay at his place if I needed to, and I was seriously considering it. The thought of returning to that house, to the memories of what I'd seen and heard, made my stomach turn. As I sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at my phone, I realized something: this wasn't just about Lydia anymore. It was about me, what I wanted, what I was willing to tolerate. For years, I'd built my life around her, around the idea of us. But now, that foundation was cracked, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to rebuild it. After talking with Jake, I spent the better part of the morning sitting on the edge of that motel bed, staring at nothing. My emotions shifted between anger, heartbreak, and a crushing sense of uncertainty. Jake's advice lingered in my mind: take your time, but don't let her guilt trap you. It was sound advice, but easier said than done. Eventually, I decided to return home, not because I was ready to face Lydia, but because I couldn't keep running. My life was there, for better or worse, and I needed to confront what it had become. As much as I hated the thought of seeing her, I knew I couldn't stay away forever. Not if I wanted to figure out what came next. The drive back felt surreal, like I was heading toward a battleground I didn't want to step onto. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my hands were trembling. Lydia's car was there, parked neatly like it always was. The sight of it made my stomach twist. I sat in my own car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel and trying to summon the courage to go inside. When I finally walked through the front door, the house was quiet. Too quiet. It felt heavy, like the air itself was charged with tension. Lydia was sitting on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest and her arms wrapped around them. She looked up when she heard me, her face pale and drawn. The circles under her eyes told me she hadn't slept any more than I had. "Mark," she said softly, her voice trembling. She started to get up, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't," I said, my voice flat. "Just, don't." Her face crumpled, and she sank back onto the couch. "I didn't know if you were coming back," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I stood there, staring at her, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to demand answers she couldn't possibly give. But another part, the part that was exhausted and numb, couldn't summon the energy. Instead, I walked past her, heading toward the bedroom. I needed space, even if it was just the illusion of it. She didn't follow me, which I was grateful for. Inside the bedroom, I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, burying my face in my hands. The room felt unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of her: the framed photo of us on the nightstand, her perfume on the dresser, the neatly folded sweater draped over the chair. It was suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a soft knock on the door. "Mark?" Lydia's voice was tentative, full of hesitation. I didn't answer, but she pushed the door open anyway. She stood there, her eyes red and swollen from crying, clutching a tissue in her hand. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Please. I need to explain." I looked up at her, my jaw tight. "Explain what, Lydia? That you've been sneaking around with David? That you've been lying to me for weeks? I already know all of that." "It's not that simple," she said, stepping into the room. I know I messed up, Mark. I know I betrayed you, and I hate myself for it. But I need you to understand why it happened." I let out a bitter laugh. "Why it happened? You mean why you decided to throw away our marriage for some guy you used to love?" "Sure, Lydia. Go ahead. Explain." She flinched at the venom in my voice but pressed on. "It wasn't about him," she said, her voice cracking. "It was about me. About feeling like I'd lost something, like I wasn't the person I used to be. Seeing David again brought back memories of a time when I felt free and alive, before all the disappointments, before me, I finished for her," my voice sharp. "No," she said quickly, her eyes wide. "Not before you. Mark, you've been the best thing in my life. But after everything we've been through, trying for a family, failing, the stress of work, it felt like I was drowning. And when David showed up, it was like a lifeline. It was stupid and selfish, and I hate myself for it, but it wasn't about you. It was about me being too weak to handle my own feelings. Her words cut deep, each one slicing through the remnants of my trust. So what now? I asked, my voice hollow. You say it wasn't about me, but it sure as hell affected me. It destroyed us, Lydia. So where do we go from here? I don't know, she admitted, tears streaming down her face. I just know that I love you, Mark. I want to fix this, if you'll let me. Please, give me a chance to make things right. I stared at her, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, hurt, and something I couldn't quite name. Could I give her that chance? Did I even want to? Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with desperation and regret. I love you. I want to fix this. A part of me wanted to believe her, to cling to the hope that we could somehow salvage what we'd built. But another part, the part still reeling from the betrayal, wasn't sure if I could ever trust her again. I stood and walked toward the window, staring out at the yard. It was easier than looking at her, at the face I'd loved for so long but now felt like a stranger's. Lydia, I said finally, my voice low, I don't even know where to start. You say you love me, that you want to fix this. But how am I supposed to believe that when you've been lying to me for weeks? When you chose him over me? I didn't choose him, she said quickly, her voice trembling. Mark, I was lost. I made terrible decisions, but it wasn't because I didn't love you. It was because I didn't know how to deal with my own feelings. I never stopped loving you. I turned to face her, my expression hard. You say that, but your actions tell a different story. Do you have any idea what it's like to see the person you love with someone else? To feel like your whole life has been a lie? Tears streamed down her face, but I pressed on. You didn't just betray me, Lydia. You betrayed us. The life we built together. And I don't know if I can come back from that. I know, she whispered, her voice breaking. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't take back. But I'm begging you, Mark. Don't let this be the end. Let me prove to you that I can be better, that I can earn back your trust. Her plea hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to believe her, to believe that we could somehow rebuild what we'd lost. But trust wasn't something that could be restored overnight. It was fragile, and she'd shattered it. I need time, I said finally, my voice tight. I can't make any decisions right now. I don't even know how I feel about you anymore. Her face crumpled, but she nodded. I understand, she said softly. Take all the time you need. I'll do whatever it takes, Mark. Whatever it takes to fix this. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked past her and out of the room, needing space to think. I found myself back in the living room, staring at the photos on the wall. There was one of us on our wedding day, smiling and full of hope for the future. I barely recognized the people in that photo anymore. The man I used to be, the woman I thought I knew, they were gone. The hours passed slowly, the silence in the house oppressive. Lydia stayed in the bedroom, giving me the space I'd asked for, but her presence lingered in the air. Every corner of the house was a reminder of her, of us. And I couldn't escape the question that kept circling in my mind, was there anything left to save? Later that evening, I picked up my phone and called Jake again. He answered on the first ring. Hey, man. How are you holding up? I don't know, I admitted, sinking onto the couch. I talked to her. She's sorry. Says she wants to fix things. And what do you want? Jake asked, his voice calm but firm. I don't know, I said again, frustration creeping into my tone. I love her, Jake. But I don't know if that's enough. She broke my trust, and I don't know if I can get that back. Trust is everything, he said after a pause. Without it, the relationship doesn't work. But if you think there's a chance, if you think you can rebuild it, it's worth trying. Just don't let her guilt you into staying if your heart's not in it." His words gave me a lot to think about. After we hung up, I sat there in the quiet, weighing my options. Staying would mean trying to rebuild something that might already be broken beyond repair. Leaving would mean starting over, letting go of the life I'd spent years building with her. Neither option felt right. But I knew I couldn't stay in limbo forever. Eventually, I'd have to make a choice. The following days were some of the hardest I'd ever endured. The house felt like a prison, each room filled with reminders of the life Lydia and I had built, and the betrayal that had shattered it. She tried to give me space, keeping her distance while still making small attempts to show she cared. She'd leave coffee on the counter for me in the morning or quietly clean up after dinner without a word. But her presence, no matter how subdued, was suffocating. I spent most of my time out of the house, taking long drives or sitting alone in the office at the dealership. It was easier to stay busy, to avoid the questions that gnawed at me when I was alone. Did I still love her? Could I ever forgive her? And if I did, would I ever truly trust her again? One evening, after another restless day, I found myself back at the lake. The water was calm, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the surface. It was quiet except for the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Sitting there, I finally allowed myself to feel everything I'd been suppressing: anger, heartbreak, and, to my surprise, an aching sadness for what we'd lost. The truth was, I did still love her. Even after everything, my heart wasn't ready to let her go. But love wasn't the only thing that made a marriage work. Trust, respect, honesty, those were the foundations, and hers had crumbled. I thought about what Jake had said: trust is everything. Without it, the relationship doesn't work. He was right. But trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. It would take time, effort, and a willingness to confront the wounds she'd caused. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized I needed to talk to Lydia, not to rehash the past or assign blame, but to figure out where we stood. If there was any hope for us, it would require both of us to be brutally honest about what we wanted and whether we could truly move forward. When I got home, the house was quiet, the lights dim. Lydia was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Mark," she said softly, sitting up. "I wasn't sure if you were coming back tonight." I nodded, setting my keys on the table. "We need to talk." Her face paled, but she nodded. "Okay." I sat down across from her, my hands clasped tightly in front of me. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I began. "About us. About everything that's happened." She leaned forward, her eyes pleading. "Mark, Let me finish," I said, cutting her off gently. She nodded, sitting back as tears welled in her eyes. "I love you, Lydia. I always have. But what you did, it broke something in me. Something I'm not sure can be fixed. Trust isn't just about words, it's about actions. And right now, I don't know if I can trust you again." Her tears spilled over, but she didn't interrupt. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to continue. "That doesn't mean I don't want to try. But if we're going to have any chance at fixing this, it has to start with complete honesty. No more lies, no more secrets. And it's not going to be easy. For either of us." She wiped her cheeks, her voice trembling. "I'll do whatever it takes, Mark. I'll go to therapy, counseling, whatever you want. Just please, don't give up on us." I nodded slowly. "Therapy is a start. For both of us. But you need to understand that this isn't something that can be fixed overnight. It's going to take time. And there are no guarantees." "I understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I'll do anything, Mark. I just want a chance to make this right." For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel: hope. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. I didn't know if we could ever fully repair what had been broken, but I was willing to try. And for now, that was enough. The days that followed were filled with cautious steps. Lydia and I both knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. The first step we took was agreeing to attend couples therapy. Neither of us had ever been in therapy before, and walking into that room for the first time felt intimidating. But it also felt necessary, like a lifeline for a drowning relationship. In therapy, everything was laid bare. The therapist encouraged us to speak openly and honestly, no matter how painful it was. Lydia admitted that she had felt lost and overwhelmed by the pressures of our life together, pressures neither of us had fully addressed. She also took full responsibility for her actions, acknowledging the damage she'd done and expressing deep remorse. Hearing her say those things didn't erase the pain, but it was a start. For my part, I shared the anger, hurt, and betrayal that had consumed me since discovering the affair. I talked about how it had made me question everything: our marriage, her love for me, even my own self-worth. It wasn't easy to open up like that, but it felt cathartic, like releasing a weight I'd been carrying for too long. Outside of therapy, things were tentative. We worked on rebuilding trust, though it wasn't an easy process. Lydia was transparent about her whereabouts and made an effort to involve me in her life again. She stopped taking late-night calls and put her energy into us rather than her work. But even with her efforts, there were moments when I struggled, when the memory of her betrayal crept in and threatened to undo the progress we'd made. One evening, about a month after we'd started therapy, I asked her a question that had been nagging at me: why did you choose to come back? After everything, why not just leave and be with him? She looked at me, her eyes filled with regret but also sincerity. Because I love you, Mark. I made a horrible mistake, but I never stopped loving you. I realized that what I felt for David was more about escaping my own unhappiness than about him. And when I saw what I was doing to you, to us, I knew I couldn't keep running. I had to face the damage I'd caused and try to make it right. Her words didn't magically heal the wounds, but they gave me clarity. She wasn't trying to excuse what she'd done, she was owning it. And for the first time, I felt like we were on the same page. Months turned into a year. The work was grueling, and there were times when I wondered if it was worth it. But slowly, things began to change. The trust that had been shattered started to rebuild, piece by piece. It wasn't perfect, there were still scars, and some days were harder than others, but it was progress. The experience taught me more than I ever wanted to know about pain, forgiveness, and resilience. I learned that love isn't always enough to sustain a marriage, it takes effort, honesty, and a willingness to confront the hard truths. And while I'll never forget what happened, I've come to understand that healing is possible, even after the deepest wounds. To anyone reading this who might be going through something similar, here's my advice: take your time. Don't rush into forgiveness or decisions you're not ready to make. And most importantly, remember that it's okay to prioritize your own well-being. Whether you choose to stay or walk away, the choice has to be yours, and it has to be one you can live with. As for Lydia and me, we're still working on it. Some days are good, others are challenging. But for now, we've chosen to move forward together, one step at a time.